So let's kick things off then. So as we kind of teed up there a little bit, the session that we're going to talk about now with Alex and with Betsy is, how are we managing our spend in these volatile times? How are we reacting to inflation, to cost increase or price increase requests because of inflation? What can we do about it? What can't we do about it? How can we mitigate it? I think those are all things that we're really interested in. So without further ado, Betsy and Alex, I'm going to go into the background here. I'm going to go into the chat. Wow, Thomas, sea freight's 1,000% plus. I've been reading about 10x container costs from last year. So I'm going to leave it to you, Betsy, and you, Alex. I'll be in the comments, and then I'll jump back in towards the end.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Okay. Well, I think this slide echoes a lot of what a lot of people have been saying. So, we'll kind of start out by talking about what is the current market condition, what's happening in the current market. Definitely demand is far outpacing supply, which is, causing inflationary effects across almost every category. I mean, there isn't a category today, whether you're on the indirect, the direct side, goods, services, that isn't somehow impacted. And, a lot of it, especially on the materials side, does come down to the raw materials. You can see, in this graphic here, you've got aluminum and copper, up over 200%, fuel's up 100%. Joe was mentioning earlier about the negative outlook on fuel just a few years ago. And here we are, seeing prices increasing by 100%. Tomas is talking about, freight 1,000%. I've got a good friend who owns a sporting goods company, and they're, shipping containers from Asia to the US. And, they used to pay, $4,000 per container, and now they're paying $20,000. And so it's like, even, the questions that we're looking at are, so is this, is it a correction, potentially an overcorrection for the past, 10 years of relatively stable pricing? Is it, purely a reaction to the pandemic, to, some other market issues? And when it, quote unquote, settles, where is it going to settle? So if it was 4,000 a container and now it's 20,000, what's the settle point? Does 20,000 become the new normal? Is it going to settle, but maybe it's going to settle back at 10? And so, these are the types of challenges that are created for procurement in these environments. I mean, obviously the price increases, reducing your negotiation leverage. In many cases, as well, you're finding that suppliers that you were able to count on time and time and time again, all of a sudden, are telling you, sorry, I can't help you. Or my supplier is charging me this, so now I need to pass some of that on to you. So what we're going to talk about today are, so what on earth can you do about this? And I want to bring in Alex, who has a lot of experience, whether it's, experience with the tariff issue we saw several years ago, political considerations and political events and how those can impact pricing, and then obviously, when market prices are going haywire. And so I'm going to ask Alex to lead us through a couple of, actually 3 specific tactics and approaches that you can use to try to negate some of these effects. And then immediately following this session, we're going to go into, we're calling it a bite-sized learning because we have a much longer should cost modeling training that we do for clients, but we've distilled that down into a 30-minute session, and Jake Taylor is going to take us through how to approach should cost modeling, because that's another kind of tool in your toolkit that you can use to combat some of these effects. So Alex, let me just go ahead and bring you in here. And if you can go ahead and move to the next slide. And we'll just jump right in. I guess my first question is, do you have any comment on anything I just said already? Or maybe you can kind of set up some situations that you've been involved in the past where you've had to employ some of these tactics. And then I would just say, go ahead and jump right in and get into the specifics of how we can use transparent and deconstructed pricing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to first respond to Phil's question that was posed to kick off this session, I was actually spending time with a colleague friend of mine last Friday afternoon, and he works in procurement as well, and received a call at about 5:30 from a supplier saying they needed to pass along a price increase that would be effective Monday. So echoing a lot of the comments that we're seeing from those that are in the session, we experience it as well. And as Betsy mentioned, so a lot of my experience in the past was sourcing steel fabrications and raw steel. And just to expand on a few of those examples that Betsy gave, the first one that I'm sure we all remember were those steel tariffs that were passed in 2017, 2018, led to a lot of challenges sourcing steel fabrications and raw steel from those Asian countries. And so we had to revisit a number of our award recommendation as the savings that we thought we were getting really evaporated overnight when those tariffs were put into place. And then the second example, and really why I love procurement so much, is the geopolitical relationship that it has. It's not really just looking at how can we buy these materials, but there's so many other factors outside of that that weigh into the overall total cost of ownership. And that political example that Betsy gave was, again, sourcing steel fabrication in Europe. We were looking at purchasing a number of parts from Eastern Europe. And in that 2018-2019 timeframe, we saw a number of political factors transition. So as nationalist leaders were elected into many of these Eastern European countries, the labor wages were passed and doubled in some cases overnight. And again, many of those savings that we saw, or what we were anticipating seeing, evaporated overnight and caused us to have to revisit our award recommendation. And so that then leads into what can we actually do about it? And so there are three different scenarios that we'll touch on today. The first is transparent and deconstructed pricing. The second is how to effectively set up and manage your contracts in place. And then touching on a topic that the previous sessions have touched on is the importance of establishing cross-functional teams throughout your organization and working with those various functions to ensure that you're prepared and proactive in response to adverse market conditions. And so just to jump into transparent and deconstructed pricing. So I really think this is the most important step to start with, as without having that visibility and transparency into how your suppliers are pricing, whether it's their services or materials, you really don't have a chance to be able to appropriately respond in the event of changing market conditions, whether it be inflation, raw material price increases, et cetera. And so there's an illustrative example that's at the bottom of this slide. And what I'll just do is touch on how you get to this point. And so really the purpose of this is disaggregating all of the various cost components. And so if you're looking at a material purchase, asking your supplier to separate the cost of raw material, the cost of the labor, the cost of packaging, shipping, profit, and overhead, just to allow your organization, your procurement organization, to have full visibility into the various cost components of that part or service, as well as provide additional visibility into if there is, say, an increase in raw material, what specific percentage of this part or of this category will be susceptible to those market risks. Equally as important as establishing the right processes is making sure that you're training into your individuals, your buyers, your supply management agents to make sure that they have familiarity and know how to analyze these quote forms that you receive from supplier RFP proposals to ensure that they know how to zero in on those value add components, allowing them to have more productive negotiations and allowing them to focus their time on those value add segments. Betsy, any comments just as I'm going?
So I have I guess a question for you, which is, and maybe this is something, I think it's mostly applicable at this point, is, one of the things that we talk a lot about in procurement, and Joe alluded to this earlier about, using market indices as a data point for determining price reasonableness, and then, capturing the value of what procurement is able to negotiate that's lower than that index. And, when you're talking about, these types of inflationary environments, the idea of hard cost savings is very challenging, yet most procurement teams today are measured almost solely on hard cost savings. I'm curious in the past when you've employed this approach, and if it didn't result in savings, but at least allowed you to remain flat or with a modest increase, what's been your experience with the willingness of the stakeholder or whomever it is, finance, to recognize that as savings?
Different answer depending on the client. Some I think we can all expect weren't as open to it, but there were others that were. And I think the importance of getting that stakeholder buy-in is, first off, establishing a baseline that all parties agree to. So if you're doing wave-based sourcing or strategic sourcing for a category, drawing that line in the sand that this is the baseline price as of this month, this date, and really keeping that as a starting point for any future price movements. Second, making sure that you have the right data in place to visually show the impacts of either future savings, whether it's cost reduction programs that are guaranteed, or increases. So inflation, increases in raw material, increases in labor wages, et cetera. It's really about, one, starting off with stakeholder buy-in, getting all parties to agree to that baseline date, and then making sure that you have the right data in place to appropriately monitor and track as you go on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, again, this is something procurement really hasn't had to think too hard about for at least a dozen years. And so I think, and I'm kind of, the wheels are turning for a future session with our Art of Procurement friends is how do we capture value during these times? And so I threw a question in the chat. I'm just curious, as Alex is describing some of these methods, what are you experiencing with your organization's willingness to give you credit for savings when all you're really doing is working as hard as you can to try to even just stay even? So anyway, Alex, back to you. And I think, Art of Procurement had a great point here that, comparing data from supplier to supplier, or even data that the same supplier provides to multiple buyers, can be really helpful, because they might not be providing, this type of deconstructed pricing in the same way, even if it's the same company to two different buyers. So they may say in one instance their packaging is $4.50, in another it's $4.25, or their profit is $5.20, or it's $5.
Yep.
And so I'm also curious, when you, especially when you start talking about overhead profit, things like that, what's been your experience with suppliers' willingness to provide this level of detail?
Yeah, and it's funny, I'm seeing that question start to come in on the chat on the right as well. It's mixed, but I think when you position it as what's in it for them, you'll have much more success. Starting off with materials. So something that we saw, again, landing on the steel fabrication example from a few years back, a number of suppliers initially pushed back. However, when we position it as the company that I work for is significantly larger, has much more buying power in the marketplace, perhaps once you share the cost of your raw material, for example, I can have visibility and perhaps use my material contracts that I have in place with my raw material suppliers, share those contacts with you, and give you the opportunity to buy at the same price that I am, leveraging my company's buying power. And we saw a number of companies that were initially hesitant. And once they had that intel, we shared those contacts with those raw material suppliers. They were able to realize savings not only on the parts that they were supplying to our company, but also with some of their other customers as well. Same thing with shipping. If there's better shipping contracts that are in place with whether it's FedEx, UPS, other global companies, again, leverage that buying power of your company and extend those contacts to your suppliers to give them the opportunity to pass on some of those efficiencies to other customers.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, the thing that we often overlook in these situations, because we're the buyer, is we feel like everything's being dumped on us. But, there are opportunities to actually improve your supplier relationships and take more of a long-term strategic view with your suppliers. And, that in many cases, they're suffering the same issues. Again, going back to my sporting goods friend, if his shipping costs are now fivefold what they were 2 years ago, how much of that can he realistically pass on to his suppliers or to his customers? And, I think, being able to look at a more holistic way at the supplier-buyer relationship and, how we can make adjustments for that, that can benefit everybody in the long run, I think is, a much better approach than just trying to deal with it piecemeal.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think just, the two examples that I gave earlier were more on the raw material or shipping side, but even at the labor, if we're seeing quotes return from suppliers that have way too much labor than what the engineers originally thought, that gives our engineers the opportunity to perhaps redesign or propose process efficiencies onto the supplier to, again, help them be more efficient with the parts that they're supplying us, as well as the parts that they're supplying other customers, sharing those best practices and ideas to help the marketplace be more efficient. So I think there's a number of benefits, of course, for the customer by having this transparent and deconstructed pricing, but also for the supplier.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, why don't we move on to the next technique? And so, kind of picking up on that theme, establishing and managing supplier contracts. So, how have you, or I guess what methods have you used focusing more on the contractual relationship to help mitigate some of these impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think as we've touched on in many of the previous sessions, the importance of incorporating indices and or into your contracts, both for services and for materials. I think it's important to think of establishing and managing the supplier contracts as step two. Step one is really that transparent and deconstructed pricing. I think too often we receive a communication from a supplier that says the price of raw material has gone up by 5%, and thus the price of the finished good to the customer goes up by 5%. Once you have that transparent and deconstructed pricing, you can know exactly what percentage of the total cost of the part is raw material. And then as the index increases, you can adjust just that specific component of the part price. So not seeing just a flat adder overall. In terms of actually incorporating these indices into your contract, I think there's a number of benefits and approaches that you can take. I think first off, using different indices as a stability mechanism. So if there's for steel indices, having a variety of different indexes for steel across your key suppliers, just in case you're seeing different movement on one versus the other, helps spread out that risk across your contract. Additionally, I guess I should have started with this. Step one is identifying where are your supplier contracts that are most susceptible to risk. So are there particular categories that you're buying from top suppliers that are primarily raw material or primarily labor? Those would be the categories to zero in on and prioritize for incorporating those raw material index or those cost of living adjustment indexes. Oh, go ahead, Betsy.
No, you go ahead. Keep going.
Oh, sounds good. I think another key thing to add is establishing those regular cadences for when pricing is to be updated. So as opposed to following an index reactive, every day the index moves, the price of the part moves, instead consider a quarterly, a semi-annual, or if you can get a supplier to agree to it, an annual pricing update period. And rather than looking at the index on the day or the week before the next pricing adjustment period, use a rolling average of the past 3 months. Helps level out some of those adjustments and swings that we'll see both up and down. And again, add more stability to both sides of that agreement.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I wish we could replay the last 2 minutes because I think that was so packed full of like great ideas and thoughts of, I love the idea of using the index to, tie us to a specific component of your pricing. And that so often, suppliers will just say, oh, it's a 5% increase across the board, without really providing, the justification. And that when you start to, when you look at the detailed, back to the previous slide, when you look at the deconstructed costs, you see, well, it's really just the shipping cost that's increased, not everything. So, okay, fine. And, Bill was mentioning in the chat, I think it was Bill or maybe Richard, that agreeing to, some of these increases as surcharges, as opposed to price increases, because that way it allows you to isolate the increases. And, when we do hopefully, kind of move back to a less volatile environment, you can then say, okay, well, that was a surcharge and it was based on this environment. We're now out of that environment. So, that surcharge should go away. So I think just some great, really, actionable insights from you here. And I think, why don't we go ahead and move on to the last one and talk a bit about cross-functional partnership. As you said, we did talk about this in the previous session and the importance for procurement to, really take a lead role in that cross-functional relationship across finance, operations, engineering, and so I'll let you, speak to this one a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. And sorry, Betsy, just want to address two of the comments that we just got in the chat. Yes, works for exchange rates as well. And then two, highly recommend using that plus minus for those indexes that trigger. So if it's, say, a 3% buffer on the other side, if the price of the index is within that 3% buffer, no pricing changes. If it goes beyond that, then the pricing would update. So I think those are both great ideas that I've implemented in the past.
Great.
To transition to cross-functional partnership, so again, making sure that you're working with the various functional areas within your organization, finance, operation, and engineering being the three most prevalent here. Finance, we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail during Jake's session, which is next. And that's establishing those pricing models, those should cost analysis, to make sure that you're able to have actionable data that you are then able to use to forecast the impact of future price increases. So again, leaning back to the transparent and deconstructed pricing, the incorporation of indexes with these should cost models, your organization should be able to forecast the impact of, say, a 6% increase in steel, understanding what are the categories that have that are steel related and how much of the overall price is steel. And so using those should cost models, your organization should be able to identify what are those specific impacts as indexes or market conditions occur. The second cross-functional example would be operations. And so the potential to buy and hold additional inventory. So again, only if space is permitting, only if it's operationally efficient for your organization, varies by company. But if you do have the luxury of space or additional warehousing, consider identifying what are those materials that are most susceptible to outside market conditions and holding a little additional inventory when that index drops to a semi-annual low or a quarterly low. Provides you with a little extra flexibility and stability should market conditions change 3, 6, 12 months down the road. Third is engineering. So again, as others have said, the importance of working with engineering really allows procurement organizations to be much more agile and responsive when something occurs. So just partnering with your engineering to make sure they're constantly evaluating alternative methods of design, alternative materials, alternative sources of supply, just so if there is a condition, particularly in the global marketplace. So when we see a tariff on China and Asian countries, your company should be agile enough and in partnership with engineering enough where you can quickly switch that source of a supply or switch that material to another comparable material to adjust when those conditions change.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point about, we talked earlier about looking for the signals and, that you need to understand the signals in that to know when your data is telling you that something needs to happen or that you need to take action. And I think that this is a great example of how you can do that, of saying, okay, well, if I, if I look for, if I define what I want my trigger point to be for, looking at my inventory, for example, then, once you start having visibility to that, you can look for that trigger, and then that you need to take some sort of action. Or, what we talked about a couple minutes ago about tying pricing to a plus minus on an index, that becomes your trigger to say, okay, I know I need to do something. So, it's defining the signals in your data and, knowing what to do when those signals, start flashing. The art of procurement.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Betsy.
Oh, no, I was going to say art of procurement asked a great question. And I have another question too, but I thought this would be a great one to ask is, so, when all else fails, you've done absolutely everything you can, and you've worked your tail off to try to keep the price increase as low as you can, but you've got to just swallow the fact that you're dealing with a price increase. How do you approach communicating that internally? How do you break that news to finance, to your stakeholder? What's been your experience with that, Alex?
And so I think that when you have these indices and these stability mechanisms incorporated into your contracts, it's a really easy conversation, both internally and externally. And so internally, starting first with internally, having those should cost models, incorporating these indices to give the full organization transparency into what that impact will be by category. That way there's not any surprises. They're seeing the data for themselves. They're seeing the price of labor increase. They're seeing the price of raw material increase. They have visibility into what that impact will be. And then the same thing on the external side. So I think that a challenge that we face in procurement organization is that conflict and that argument or negotiation that we have with suppliers, sometimes getting into a hostile conversation. When there's clear, defined mechanisms incorporated into the contract, it removes that conflict conversation with the vendor, both positive and down. So when the price of the index increases, everyone involved knows that we're going to see a price increase. Same thing on the other side. When the index decreases, everyone knows that we're going to see a price decrease on that part. And so I think that luxury of conflict mitigation is another huge benefit of a number of these different ideas that we've talked about in this session.
Yeah, totally agree. I think the power of data in addressing some of these challenges can't really be overstated, because it's, when you're sitting down with a supplier and saying, well, this is what the data is showing me, so therefore my negotiation position is based on this. Like you say, it kind of removes the emotion from the conversation, and it just becomes really a fact-based discussion. Same thing with the internal communication. And I think, again, this is a situation, and I'd love to, keep hearing what others have to say about this, is, how do you communicate that increase? But also, what happens to the value tracking associated with that, and being able to demonstrate, look, I did this and this and this and this and this, and this is the best we can do. And yes, it's an increase, but it's less than we would have had if I hadn't done all of these things. Being able to have that as a, maybe not a quote unquote savings conversation, but at the minimum a value conversation. I think when you have all of that underlying data to support your position, it, obviously everybody can be unreasonable whenever they want, but it makes it less, it makes it a little harder to be unreasonable in those situations. I know we just have a couple of minutes, and there's one thing that I was wanting to ask you, because earlier the comment was made about, a lot of what we're talking about here relates to components and raw materials, but a lot of what you've talked about also applies to services. And I'm just wondering, do you do anything differently when you're approaching a price increase for services, or do you feel like a lot of the techniques that you've used in the past to address material prices can also be applied to services?
I think it's very similar. I think that unfortunately we don't see a lot of these techniques applied to services to the extent that we do in materials. And I think that, again, leads to a lot of uncomfortable conversations with consulting, contingent labor, et cetera, as they want to increase their hourly rate on a year-to-year basis. And so I think by incorporating these cost of living adjustments or other labor-related indices, it again removes that shadow of a doubt. We have set predefined periods when pricing updates are permitted, and really following the data plus or minus.
Yeah. No, I think this was excellent, Alex. Thank you so much for walking us through this. The chat has been super busy, with a lot of people commenting on the techniques and methods that their organizations have used. So a ton of great suggestions, and I hope everybody found this useful. And don't go anywhere, because we're going to keep talking about how to approach price increases in just a few minutes. Phil, any closing comments from you?
Yeah, I just want to echo your thoughts, Alex. Really, really good session. I really appreciate. There's a lot to learn, and also in the comments, I think what really the great thing about events like this is when we're all helping each other based on our own experiences too. And so seeing a lot of the comments go by of different things that a number of us are putting into action and doing on a day-to-day basis, I think is really valuable for all of us. So thank you. And Betsy, thank you for facilitating.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All right.
So we're going to be going next. I think we have a solo artist on stage next with Jake. Betsy, you can take a breather for a minute. We're going to have Jake Taylor, who is coming off the tour bus as we speak and heading into the next session, where he's going to be giving us a little bit of a training session on should cost modeling. Again, I think should cost modeling is another one of those things that is kind of known within the direct space now. Some organizations are more effective at using it than others in the direct space, but that provides a big opportunity in the services space as well. And it's one of the areas where I don't see that we use should cost modeling effectively.